The scorching heat of the Arizona desert gave way to an eerie chill as the darkness fell over Phoenix. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but here on the outskirts, shadows reigned supreme. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the sparse vegetation, my feet kicking up clouds of dust with each desperate stride. The sound of my ragged breathing was drowned out by the blood rushing in my ears and the terrifying howl that echoed through the night. I shouldn't have come out here alone. I shouldn't have ignored the warnings. But it was too late for regrets now. All that mattered was survival. My name is Natalie, and this is the story of how I came face to face with a nightmare, a creature I thought only existed in folklore and bad Hollywood movies. This is the tale of my encounter with the Werewolf of Phoenix. It had all started innocently enough. As a 26-year-old freelance journalist, I was always on the lookout for my next big story. When I heard whispers of strange animal attacks on the outskirts of Phoenix, I saw an opportunity. Little did I know that my curiosity would lead me into a night of pure terror. The locals had been talking about it for weeks. Livestock found torn apart, strange tracks that didn't match any known predator, and eerie howls echoing through the night. Some dismissed it as the work of coyotes or feral dogs, but others spoke in hushed tones of something far more sinister. I had spent the day interviewing ranchers and examining the sites of recent attacks. As the sun began to set, I decided to take one last look around before heading back to the city. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Slowly I turned around, and that's when I saw it. Illuminated by the fading twilight was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It stood on two legs, towering at least 7 feet tall, its body a grotesque mixture of man and wolf. Matted fur covered its muscular frame, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly amber light. But it was the teeth that truly terrified me. Rows of razor-sharp fangs, gleaming with saliva in the dying light. For a moment, we stood frozen, locked in a terrifying standoff. Then with a bone-chilling howl, it lunged towards me. Instinct took over, and I ran. And so here I was, running for my life through the desert night, with a monster from legend hot on my heels. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but the sound of heavy footfalls and snapping jaws behind me kept me moving. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The werewolf was gaining on me, its powerful legs eating up the distance between us with terrifying speed. In the moonlight, I could see strings of saliva hanging from its open maw, its eyes fixed on me with predatory focus. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. Up ahead, I spotted a cluster of large boulders. It wasn't much, but it was the only cover in sight. With a burst of desperate energy, I changed course, making for the rocks. I reached the boulders just as I felt the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck. Diving between two large rocks, I scrambled deeper into the formation, squeezing through narrow gaps and scraping my skin raw on the rough stone. The werewolf's furious roar shook the very ground as it realized its prey had momentarily escaped. I could hear it circling the boulders, sniffing and growling, searching for a way to reach me. My temporary sanctuary suddenly felt like a trap. I was cornered with nowhere to run. As I huddled in the darkness, trying to control my panicked breathing, my mind raced. How was this possible? Werewolves were myths, stories told around campfires to scare children. Yet the very real sounds of claws scraping against stone and inhuman snarls told me otherwise. I fumbled for my phone, hoping against hope that I had a signal out here in the desert. To my amazement, I had one bar. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice of the dispatcher was like a lifeline in the chaos. Please, you have to help me, I whispered, terrified that the creature would hear me. I'm being chased by something, a monster, a werewolf. I know how it sounds, but please, you have to believe me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost feel the dispatcher's skepticism. Ma'am, where are you located? I tried to explain my location as best I could, describing the ranch I had visited earlier and the direction I had run. As I spoke, a horrifying realization dawned on me. Even if they believed me, help would take time to arrive. Time I didn't have. As if to emphasize this point, a massive clawed hand suddenly thrust into the gap above me, raking the air where my head had been moments before. I screamed, dropping the phone and pressing myself against the far side of my rocky shelter. The werewolf's frustration was palpable. It began to slam its body against the boulders, each impact sending tremors through the stone. Dust and small rocks rained down on me. With growing horror, I realized that it was only a matter of time before the creature found a way in, or brought the entire formation down on top of me. I needed a weapon, anything to defend myself. My hands scrabbled in the dirt, searching desperately for something, anything I could use. My fingers closed around a jagged piece of rock, and I clutched it like a lifeline. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The impacts grew more intense. Larger rocks began to shift and fall. A gap appeared in the stone above me, and a shaft of moonlight pierced the darkness. With it came the werewolf's arm, claws slashing wildly, trying to reach me. In that moment, faced with imminent death, something inside me snapped. Fear gave way to a primal rage, a desperate will to survive. With a scream that tore at my throat, I lashed out with my makeshift weapon, driving the jagged stone into the creature's arm with all my strength. The werewolf's howl of pain was deafening. It withdrew its arm, giving me a moment's respite. But I knew it wouldn't last. The assault on my shelter resumed with renewed fury, the impacts growing stronger, the gaps widening. I pressed myself into the farthest corner, clutching my bloodied stone, waiting for the final attack. The sound of rending stone filled the air as the werewolf tore at the boulders, widening the opening. I could see its glowing eyes filled with inhuman hunger and rage. Just as I thought all hope was lost, a new sound cut through the night. Sirens. The cavalry had arrived, but would they be in time? The werewolf hesitated, its head swiveling towards the approaching sounds. For a moment, I dared to hope that it would flee, but then it turned back to me, a terrifying intelligence in its eyes. It knew its time was limited. With a roar of frustration and bloodlust, it redoubled its efforts to reach me. The boulders shifted ominously. Cracks appeared in the stone around me. I realized with horror that the entire formation was about to collapse. I had to move, or I'd be crushed. With no other choice, I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and launched myself towards the opening. Better to face the beast on my feet than be buried alive. I burst out of the collapsing rocks just as they came crashing down. The werewolf, caught off guard by my sudden appearance, reared back. In that split second, I saw my chance. With a cry that was part terror and part battle rage, I swung my jagged stone with all my might, aiming for the creature's eyes. The impact sent shockwaves up my arm. The werewolf howled in agony, blood streaming from its ruined eye. It staggered back, momentarily blinded and confused. I didn't waste the opportunity. I ran like I had never run before, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards the approaching lights and sirens. Behind me, I could hear the werewolf's roars of pain and fury, but I didn't dare look back. The desert landscape flew by in a blur. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed on. The lights grew closer, and I could make out the shapes of police cars and an ambulance. "Help!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. "Over here!" The vehicles screeched to a halt, and officers poured out, weapons drawn. As they rushed towards me, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The werewolf was nowhere in sight, having apparently retreated into the darkness. I collapsed into the arms of a startled paramedic, my body shaking uncontrollably. "It was real," I gasped between sobs. The werewolf, it was real. The next few hours passed in a blur. I was examined, questioned, and eventually taken to the hospital for observation. Nobody quite believed my story about a werewolf, of course. They attributed my injuries and state of shock to an attack by a large predator, possibly a mountain lion. But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt its hot breath on my skin, heard its inhuman howls. The Werewolf of Phoenix was real, and it was still out there. As I lay in the hospital bed trying to process the night's events, a grizzled detective entered my room. He introduced himself as Detective Ramirez and asked if he could ask me a few questions. I nodded, bracing myself for more skepticism. But to my surprise, Detective Ramirez didn't immediately dismiss my story. He listened intently, asking detailed questions about what I had seen and experienced. When I finished, he sat back with a thoughtful expression. "You know, miss," he said slowly, "in my 30 years on the force, I've seen things that can't be easily explained. Things that make a man question what he thinks he knows about the world." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're not the first person to report something like this in these parts. Most folks are too scared to come forward, afraid people will think they're crazy. But the attacks, the sightings, they've been happening for years." My eyes widened. You believe me?" Ramirez shrugged. "I believe you saw something out there. Something that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of the natural world. Whether it's a werewolf or something else, I can't say. But I've learned in this job that the truth is often stranger than fiction." He stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Miss Natalie, a word of advice. Be careful who you tell your story to. Not everyone is as open-minded as this old cop. And if I were you, I'd steer clear of the desert at night from now on. Whatever's out there, it's not finished." With that ominous warning, he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the memory of glowing amber eyes in the darkness. The following days were a struggle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the werewolf's terrifying visage. The sound of its howl echoed in my dreams, jolting me awake in a cold sweat. I knew I should leave Phoenix, put as much distance between myself and that creature as possible. But something held me back. The journalist in me, the part that had driven me out into the desert in the first place, couldn't let go of the story. There were too many unanswered questions. Where had the werewolf come from? Was it a lone creature, or were there others? And most importantly, who else knew about its existence? Despite the warnings from Detective Ramirez and my own better judgment, I found myself digging deeper into the mystery. I pored over old newspaper articles, police reports, and local legends. A pattern began to emerge, a history of unexplained attacks and sightings stretching back decades, always centered around the outskirts of Phoenix. One name kept coming up in my research: Dr. Elena Vasquez, a local biologist known for her unconventional theories. According to the articles I found, she had been ridiculed by the scientific community for her insistence that an unknown predator was stalking the Arizona desert. Her descriptions of the creature, based on tracks and other evidence she had gathered, matched what I had seen. I knew I had to speak with her. It took some doing, but I finally managed to track down her address. She lived in a small house on the edge of town, as close to the desert as one could get, without leaving civilization behind entirely. As I pulled up to her home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The desert stretched out behind her house, vast and inscrutable. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the scrub, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Dr. Vasquez was a small, wiry woman with piercing eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. When I told her why I had come, her initial skepticism gave way to intense curiosity. She invited me inside, and for the next several hours, we talked. I told her everything: my encounter with the werewolf, the chase through the desert, my narrow escape. She listened without interruption, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, she sat back with a grim expression. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "Most who encounter the creature aren't so fortunate." "Then you believe me? You think it's really a werewolf?" Dr. Vasquez shook her head. "I don't know if werewolf is the right term. What I do know is that there's a predator out there unlike anything in the scientific record. I've been tracking it for years, gathering evidence, trying to understand what it is and where it came from." She pulled out a map of the Phoenix area, covered in red marks. "These are all the places where attacks or sightings have occurred. Notice anything?" I studied the map. The marks formed a rough circle around the city, with a higher concentration to the north. "It's avoiding populated areas," I realized. "Exactly, Doctor." Vasquez nodded. "Whatever this creature is, it's intelligent. It stays on the fringes, where it's less likely to be seen or caught. But here's the really interesting part. The sightings go back much further than you'd think." She pulled out a dusty old book, its pages yellowed with age. "This is a collection of Native American legends from this region. There are stories in here of a beast that walks like a man but hunts like a wolf. The tribes called it Skinwalker and feared it above all other creatures." A chill ran down my spine. "You think the legends are true? That this thing has been here all along? I think there's often a kernel of truth in old legends, Dr. Vasquez replied. But whether this is the same creature from those stories or something new, I can't say. What I do know is that the attacks have been increasing in frequency over the past few years. Something has changed, made it bolder or more desperate. As we talked, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert. Dr. Vasquez grew visibly nervous, constantly glancing out the window. "You should go," she said abruptly. "It's not safe to be out here after dark." I was reluctant to leave. There was still so much I wanted to ask her, but the memory of my night in the desert was still fresh, and I had no desire to tempt fate. As I stood to leave, a thought struck me. "Dr. Vasquez, why do you stay out here if you know how dangerous it is?" She gave me a sad smile. "Because someone has to. Someone has to try to understand this creature, to find a way to protect people from it. And because," she hesitated, "because I'm the reason it's here." I stared at her in shock. "What do you mean?" Dr. Vasquez sighed heavily. "It's a long story and not one I'm proud of, but you deserve to know the truth. Come back tomorrow, during the day, and I'll tell you everything." As I drove back to the city, my mind was reeling. What did Dr. Vasquez mean? How could she be responsible for the werewolf's presence? I had come looking for answers, but instead, I had found even more questions. Little did I know, the true horror of the Werewolf of Phoenix was yet to be revealed. And my next visit to Dr. Vasquez would set in motion a chain of events that would bring me face to face with the beast once more. A confrontation that would either uncover the truth or cost me my life. The drive back to my apartment in the city was tense. Every shadow on the road seemed to move. Every rustle in the bushes along the highway made me flinch. By the time I reached the relative safety of the city lights, my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. Sleep didn't come easily that night. My dreams were a chaotic mix of glowing eyes, razor-sharp claws, and Dr. Vasquez's cryptic words. I woke several times, drenched in sweat, convinced I had heard a howl in the distance. But each time, it was just the normal sounds of the city. A siren, a car horn, the wind. As soon as the sun rose, I was up and preparing to head back to Dr. Vasquez's house. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that something momentous was about to happen. I armed myself with my voice recorder, notebook, and camera. Whatever Dr. Vasquez was going to tell me, I wanted to document every word. The desert looked different in the harsh light of day. What had been terrifying shadows the night before were now just cacti and scrub brush. But as I approached Dr. Vasquez's house, that sense of being watched returned. I scanned the landscape, half expecting to see the werewolf lurking behind a boulder, but there was nothing. Dr. Vasquez answered the door before I could knock, ushering me inside quickly. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair disheveled. The house was a mess, papers and books strewn everywhere, as if she had been searching for something all night. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice hoarse. "I've been thinking about whether I should tell you this all night, but you've seen it. You know it's real. You deserve to know the whole truth, no matter the consequences." She led me to her study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk covered in papers, animal skulls, and strange-looking instruments. On the wall was a large corkboard covered in photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all connected by a web of red string. It looked like something out of a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Dr. Vasquez took a deep breath and began her story. 10 years ago, I was a different person. Young, ambitious, desperate to make my mark on the scientific world. I had heard the legends of the skinwalker, read the old reports of strange creatures in the desert. I was convinced there was something out there, an undiscovered species that could revolutionize our understanding of evolution and biology. She paused, pouring herself a glass of water with shaking hands. I set up camp in the desert, determined to find proof. Months passed with no results. I was running out of funding, out of time. And then, one night I saw it. Her eyes took on a faraway look, reliving the memory. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. Powerful, primal, like nothing I had ever seen before. I managed to take a few blurry photos, but I knew it wasn't enough. No one would believe me without concrete evidence. So you tried to capture it? I guessed. Dr. Vasquez laughed bitterly. Capture it? No, I did something far worse. I was a geneticist by training, you see. I thought I could recreate it, create my own version that I could study, that I could present to the world as proof. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, recreate it? I collected samples, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Hair, saliva, even blood from where it had injured itself on some rocks. I analyzed the DNA, tried to isolate what made it different. And then, God help me, I experimented. She stood abruptly, pacing the room. I told myself it was for science, for the advancement of human knowledge, but really it was for my own glory. I wanted to be the one to make the discovery of the century. What happened? I asked, dreading the answer. At first, nothing. My experiments failed again and again. But then finally, I managed to create a viable embryo. I carried it myself, told everyone it was a normal pregnancy, that the father had left. No one knew the truth. I stared at her in horror, the implications of what she was saying sinking in. You mean? Yes, she nodded, tears in her eyes. The werewolf you encountered, the one that's been terrorizing the outskirts of Phoenix, it's my son. The silence that followed her revelation was deafening. I sat there trying to process what I had just heard. It seemed impossible, like something out of a science fiction novel. But after what I had seen in the desert, could I really say anything was impossible? Your son, I repeated, my voice shaky. The werewolf is your son. Dr. Vasquez nodded, slumping back into her chair. His name is Adam. For the first few years, he seemed normal. A bit wild, perhaps, but I thought that was just his personality. But as he grew older, things started to change. He became stronger, faster than any child should be. And then, on his 10th birthday, under the light of the full moon, she trailed off, lost in the painful memory. I could fill in the blanks myself. The first transformation, the realization of what she had truly created. I tried to contain him, to help him control it, she continued, but he was too strong, too wild. He escaped into the desert. I've been trying to find him, to bring him back ever since. But every time I get close, he runs. And I fear he's losing more of his humanity with each passing day. The gravity of the situation was overwhelming. This wasn't just a story anymore, not just a mysterious creature stalking the desert. This was a tragedy, a scientific experiment gone horribly wrong, with very real and deadly consequences. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Why now? Dr. Vasquez looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. Because I need your help, Natalie. You've encountered Adam and survived. You're a journalist, someone who can get the truth out there. And most importantly, you believe. You know he's real. She stood, walking over to the corkboard on the wall. I've been tracking Adam's movements, trying to predict where he'll appear next. And I think I figured it out. There's a pattern to his attacks, centered around this area. She pointed to a circled region on a map. Tonight is the full moon, she continued. He'll be at his strongest, but also his most predictable. This might be our only chance to find him, to try and bring him in. I stared at her in disbelief. Bring him in? How? He nearly killed me last time, and that was when he was just hunting. If he's stronger during the full moon... I've developed a tranquilizer, she explained, holding up a dart gun. It's specifically designed to work with his unique physiology. If we can get close enough to use it, we might be able to subdue him, to bring him somewhere safe where I can try to help him, to reverse what I've done. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was insane, that I should run as far away from this situation as possible. But another part, the part that had driven me to become a journalist in the first place, was intrigued. This was the story of a lifetime, a chance to uncover a truth that could change everything. And if we can't subdue him, I asked, if the tranquilizer doesn't work? Dr. Vasquez's face hardened. Then we'll have no choice. I created this situation, and it's my responsibility to end it. One way or another, the attacks have to stop. The implication was clear. If we couldn't capture Adam, we'd have to kill him. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but I understood the necessity. How many more people would die if we did nothing? "Okay," I said, hardly believing the words coming out of my mouth. "I'll help you, but I want the exclusive rights to this story, no matter how it ends." Dr. Vasquez nodded. "Of course. The world deserves to know the truth, even if it damns me in the process." As we began to plan our night's expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake, but it was too late to back out now. For better or worse, I was committed to seeing this through to the end. The sun began to set as Dr. Vasquez and I made our final preparations. We loaded her old pickup truck with supplies, the tranquilizer gun, first aid kits, powerful flashlights, and, as a last resort, a high-powered rifle. The weight of what we were about to do settled over us like a heavy blanket. "Are you sure about this?" I asked as we climbed into the truck. "It's not too late to call in the authorities. Let them handle it." Dr. Vasquez shook her head. "They wouldn't believe us, and even if they did, they'd kill Adam on sight. No, this is something we have to do ourselves." As we drove out into the desert, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, plunging the landscape into darkness. The full moon rose, casting an eerie glow over the sand and rocks. I couldn't help but think of how beautiful it was, even as fear gnawed at my insides. We parked the truck in a small canyon, hidden from sight. From here, we'd continue on foot. Dr. Vasquez handed me a tranquilizer pistol, showing me how to use it. "Remember," she said, "aim for large muscle groups, the thigh or the shoulder. And if you have a clear shot, don't hesitate. Every second counts." We set out into the night, our flashlights sweeping across the terrain. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of wind through the scrub brush sounded like approaching footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any sign of our quarry. After what felt like hours of tense searching, we heard it. A long, mournful howl that echoed through the canyons. It was close, much closer than I had expected. Dr. Vasquez and I exchanged a look of mingled fear and determination. This was it. We moved toward the sound, our pace quickening. As we rounded a large boulder, we saw him. Adam, the Werewolf of Phoenix, stood atop a small rise, his massive form silhouetted against the moon. He was even larger than I remembered, his muscles rippling beneath matted fur, claws gleaming in the moonlight. For a moment, he didn't seem to notice us. He stood there, sniffing the air, his head tilted back. There was something almost majestic about him, a primal power that both terrified and awed me. Then his head snapped towards us, those glowing amber eyes locking onto our position. A low growl rumbled from his chest, and I saw his muscles tense, preparing to charge. "Adam!" Dr. Vasquez called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Adam, it's me. It's your mother. Please, we're here to help you." The werewolf hesitated, his growl faltering. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in those inhuman eyes. Recognition, perhaps even a glimmer of humanity. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a feral rage. With a roar that shook the very ground, Adam launched himself towards us. Dr. Vasquez raised her tranquilizer gun, firing off a shot. The dart struck home in the creature's shoulder, but it barely seemed to slow him down. "Run!" Dr. Vasquez screamed, and we scattered. I dove behind a large rock, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I could hear the sound of rending earth as Adam's claws tore into the ground where we had been standing moments before. I risked a glance around the rock. Dr. Vasquez was scrambling up a small incline, trying to get to higher ground. Adam was between us, his massive head swinging back and forth, trying to decide which prey to pursue. His eyes locked onto me, and I saw the decision made in that terrible amber gaze. He charged, covering the distance between us with frightening speed. I raised my tranquilizer pistol with shaking hands, squeezing off a shot. Whether by luck or some hidden skill, the dart found its mark, burying itself in the werewolf's thigh. Adam stumbled, shaking his head as if to clear it. The tranquilizer was having an effect, but not quickly enough. He resumed his charge, slower now but no less determined. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a loose rock. I went down hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I rolled onto my back, looking up to see Adam looming over me, jaws open wide, saliva dripping from razor-sharp fangs. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. But then a voice rang out. Doctor. Vasquez, calling Adam's name. The werewolf's head snapped toward the sound, giving me a moment to scramble backward. Dr. Vasquez stood atop the incline, the rifle raised to her shoulder. I'm so sorry, Adam, she said, her voice choked with tears. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stand still. I saw the conflict in Adam's eyes, the battle between the human he had once been and the monster he had become. Dr. Vasquez's finger tightened on the trigger, and then something extraordinary happened. Adam's form began to shift, to shrink. The fur receded, the claws retracted. In the span of a few seconds where the werewolf had stood, there was now a young man, naked, confused, and very human. Mom, he said, his voice rough and uncertain, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. Dr. Vasquez dropped the rifle, rushing down the incline to embrace her son. They collapsed to the ground together, both sobbing. I stood on shaky legs, hardly able to believe what I had just witnessed. It was over. The nightmare was over. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The story I had uncovered was bigger than I could have ever imagined. A tale of scientific hubris, of a mother's love and guilt, of a young man's struggle against a monstrous nature he never asked for. In the days that followed, I worked with Dr. Vasquez to get Adam the help he needed. We found specialists who could work with his unique condition, who could help him learn to control his transformations. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, there was hope. The story broke worldwide. There was outrage, of course, at Dr. Vasquez's actions, at the cover-up that had allowed the attacks to continue for so long. But there was also sympathy for Adam, and a fascination with the possibilities his existence represented. As for me, I had the story of a lifetime. But more than that, I had gained a new perspective on the world. I had seen with my own eyes that reality was stranger and more wonderful than I had ever imagined. And I knew that out there, in the dark corners of the world, there were more mysteries waiting to be uncovered. The Werewolf of Phoenix was real, and if he was real, what other legends might be waiting in the shadows, ready to step into the light? As I sit here putting the finishing touches on this account, I can't help but glance out my window at the desert beyond. The night is quiet, the moon full and bright. And somewhere out there, I know Adam is learning to live with who and what he is. The werewolf that once terrorized Phoenix is gone. But the questions he raised, the possibilities he represented, will be with us for a long time to come. And as for me, I'll keep searching, keep asking questions, because now I know the truth is out there, waiting to be found, and sometimes it has teeth.